Violence is justified expression for silence.
Welcome to the semifinal round and congratulations to both teams. Am I correct? The Berkeley government?
Yes.
Right here. And let's hear from the president.
So we're not timing?
No, not introduction.
Perfect.
Overall
All right. Obviously, some thank yous are here in order because I certainly couldn't have got here by myself. First of all, thanks a lot to Elizabeth. I mean, through high school, our freshman year of college, we're already here. It's not my fault. I'm sorry about it. Blame her. So, you haven't liked us. It may have been me, but the reason why we're there, it was her. So, a lot of props. She's got me through a lot, and even though we've had our squabbles, I'm still glad we're together. Of course, the UC Berkeley debate team. Being a student-run team, I think it's really important to endorse this activity, especially in the fact that, they're our heart and soul. We don't have a coach, so, they are our coaches. They give us everything, we discuss, it's really educational, so props, thanks a lot, go Bears. We're off. Thanks, I'm really looking forward to this exciting round, I'm sure, with Truman. We've never hit before, so this should be really exciting. I'm really looking forward, maybe hooking up again over the summer, you never know. So, if you're lucky. If we're lucky. And a general apology to all of you for what may follow. To those who understand, cocaine's a hell of a drug. So with that said, we've been given a resolution today that violence is a justified expression for the silence. It even rhymes, how cute. With that said, let's go into some resolutional analysis. The first term we'd like to discuss is violence. Now, me and Elizabeth believe that violence is an act to cause pain or discomfort to other individuals. We think it's pretty clear. Justified means legitimate on a net benefits criterion. That is to say that if you believe there are more advantages than disadvantages to the action, then it would be, quote-unquote, justified. And finally, we'll be defining silence as those whose existence or discourse has been quashed. I think it's pretty clear when we get to the issue of case. You'll understand exactly what we're talking about, because the silence for those who have no other voice, and as that, we would be happy to represent, or indeed, just somehow speak for the people that have absolutely nothing to say in this round. That said, let's move into the background of today's debate. Zimbabwe is a small country of 11 million people. What we see is that their per capita GDP is just simply $2,000 per person. Not a lot of money, and most of that money is concentrated in the hands of those who would like to oppress those beneath them. Now, the unemployment rate is, of course, 25%, and 26% of the population suffers from HIV. So I think you get all the impression that this is a small country that suffers from a lot of different problems, and one of the biggest problems is, of course, Mugabe. Mugabe is the leader of the independence movement in Zimbabwe, and back in the late 1980s, the British people set up the election to install him as the leader of the country. Mugabe has been elected through a number of elections, although I think we all know that those elections are entirely illegitimate. As the leader of the opposition, Morgan Tsvangirai, when he tries to speak out against these elections, not only was he imprisoned for quote-unquote treason, he was beaten, he was scarred, he was mutilated, and as were any other people that tried to get into the ballot office so they could vote for the opposition party. At the point where these harms are occurring in the status quo, I think it's pretty clear why you're going to be voting for Berkeley at the end of this round. Now on to the harms proper. The first point we'd like to give is starvation. The 8th point here is that Mugabe ran a few years ago the land redistribution program. What this does is it stole land from the white farmers in the area, which is 80% of the farmland within the country, and gave it to farmers, people who were really just local political officials and those who supported Mugabe's hold of power. At the point where that occurred and the land was transferred, remember that these people that held power weren't necessarily skilled farmers, if farmers at all. What that means is that now in a status quo, these people, A, don't know how to farm at all, and B, they don't have the supplies to do so. Because remember, there is such a state of economic poverty. They don't have fertilizer, they don't have water, they have absolutely zero means by which to fertilize or even keep up their crop. And to the point where that is such, where there's a huge state of starvation in the country. 6 million people out of the 11 million in Zimbabwe are currently starving to death. That's a terminal impact, and that's something you certainly need to evaluate heavily in the round. With that said, I'll take your first point.
Sure, so your contention this is Mugabe's fault, and if so, how? I think I may have missed that.
Yeah, this is certainly Mugabe's fault. The land redistribution program that he runs, where he stole land from the white farmers and gave it to the people that supported his call to power. All right, the third part under this harm is that he doesn't want genetically modified food aid in his country. And so that may be all well and good. That claim is certainly legitimate. What he does is he takes that food aid regardless and diverts it to his food aid, to machine politics. What this basically does is it causes all sorts of people to starve, when all he's doing is diverting this food to other countries, to other people, so he can support their rebel claim to power and uphold other illegitimate governments in the area. Now the second harm is political oppression. The A point under here is he uses political violence and scare tactics to ensure that people don't vote or even run as the opposition party. Morgan Tsvangirai is an amazing, unique example of one person who survived to live the tale and still stands against Mugabe's terrible reign of terror. Not only redundant, but he's still bad. So anyway, obviously, this political oppression is causing problems. The B point is there's absolutely no ability to speak out. If you speak out against Mugabe, you're either killed, mutilated, your family is killed. Any number of terrible impacts, or indeed all of them, can occur at one single swoop. And at that point, people don't want to speak out against this man because they're too afraid of the impacts, because he's proven time and time again that if you ever try to knock on his government, he's going to knock on you even harder. Now we move, as for this, into the plan, because we believe it's absolutely crucial that something be done for this situation. Plan text. The United Nations Security Council will authorize the deployment of a military force to Zimbabwe. The first point. The Security Council will stipulate that the objective of the mission is to oust Mugabe and stabilize the country. The second point. This mandate will be issued under Chapter 7, which allows for force, thus giving us the resolutional link into violence in the resolution. There will be bloodshed, but that bloodshed will not be unjust. Now we move into the solvency. The first point under solvency is that the UN troops are specifically trained as peacekeepers. Granted, they're there with M16s, but they're not there just to kill like United States troops in Iraq. They're there for a purpose. They're there for a just reason, and that's what they've been trained to do. Their entire military training is not certified to seek and destroy. It's to maintain some semblance of freedom and stability within cities and throughout a country so that people can live their lives without the fear of being shot, driven past, and killed, or chopped up when they speak out against the election of an illegitimate official. Now remember, in Zimbabwe, they only have 35,000 troops. Now that may be a lot of troops, not at this time, but remember that these people are starving to death. The military is not funded at all. Tsvangirai holds complete control over them and sends them where he will, because remember, if they don't do his bidding, their families will be killed. So they have absolutely, right now, if we go in with the UN to take out Mugabe, these soldiers are not only going to turn against Mugabe, but will help us to continue to stabilize the country. And I'll take your second point.
Yeah, what are you going to do with Mugabe after you find him?
Well, we'll stipulate that. We'll leave that to the United Nations. They can do what they will with him, although we would hope there would be some sort of recourse against him for his actions that he took in hurting and indeed murdering many, if not most, of the Zimbabwean people. The second point under solvency is that there will be an environment for free and fair elections. Remember that Mugabe has held elections, they've just been illegitimate. He stuffs the ballots and scares people away. Now that we have that environment, there are people who are trained to hold elections, which means free and fair elections will occur. Advantages. Advantage 1, elections. One point is Mugabe conducted elections, like I already talked about this, and remember the empirical example here is that when we went into the United Nations, we went into East Timor, they held elections there, although they weren't the ones to hold the elections, it was the people. Remember, the people had the means by which to conduct the elections, they just never had the opportunity to do so. To the point where we give them that opportunity, there's always going to be a fair causal link that elections will occur. The second advantage is going to be regional stability. Mugabe leads military expeditions all the time into the Congo and funds rebel groups to overthrow and exploit the resources of countries neighboring his. This has caused all sorts of problems. The conflict in the Congo could have been solved a long time ago if Mugabe wasn't there. So the point where you get rid of Mugabe, you get rid of his government, you allow for a free, fair election system, and you allow for the silence to speak. Thank you.
Leader of the opposition.
I just have a short thank you, and that's to my team. Although we are not student run, we only do have one coach, And thankfully, Jacob's back to try to help us out from law school this weekend. So I think that our team has definitely picked up the load and done a lot of helping as well. So we really appreciate that, Ian and I do. But other than that, thank everyone for being here. I'm kind of disappointed that only so few of you showed up. But and I'd also like to thank our judges as well. We definitely appreciate, without you guys' dedication, we wouldn't continue on. So all right, we're going to go to 3 off-case positions and then down the case. The first off-case position we're going to go through is the criticism of violence. Subpoint A, the framework. We tell you that there are non-violent methods to produce change. Specifically, we'll give you 2 examples. You can look at Gandhi, who encouraged the Indians to line up in front of factories in order to just walk forward and let themselves be physically violated and never fight back. We would tell you that led to the crumbling of the British rule because the media reported on this and it became clear how awful they were being treated. The second we would give you here is the civil disobedience by Martin Luther King and his followers, such as standing in line outside of restaurants. So the restaurants would be, like bigoting against the restaurants. People realized how awful they were. They were setting these precedents of where blacks and whites could sit. This led to the evolution of these values and led people to realize how important this was. Subpoint B, the links, there's 2. The first which we tell you is that justifies violence. And that's the point of the case in order to go in and be violent militarily. But secondly, we tell you is we don't consider alternatives. That when you're talking about justification, and they say just use CBA, but justification means they have to prove it's the best way, that it's justified now, and that other alternatives wouldn't work, and they don't do that. Subpoint C, the impacts there are 4. The first we tell you is this turns the case, because essentially we're going to start blaming those that are violent. That as long as the military gets involved, the military is going to be seen as the bad guy because the UN is sending them in. The second that we would tell you is more on a rhetorical level, however, that this idea that violence should be encouraged drowns out the voice of the message. We can look at the example of the when instead of supporting the strikes and supporting against the WTO, when a few people broke windows, that was what it was all about now. It was about the violence in Portland and not about the other peaceful 1,200 people in the hospital. We tell you that it's more of a silencing because the original message isn't heard, not at this time. The third we would tell you is this a powerful interpretation of the messages left. That basically if you don't, that you can't ever actually say your intent when you're violent. The person that's on the other side has to determine your intent. Because of that, we tell you that leaves the person in power, the person that has it coming back to them, to determine that and reinterpret your message. So on that level, we tell you violence is always the worst way to express yourself because that means those that are the receiver get to determine it. And again, we're talking about the silenced voice now. So the loud voices will tell us what that violence means and never what you want it to mean. Finally, subpoint D, we would tell you the most important one, is that violence begets violence in return. Basically, one of Gandhi's quotes was, if it was all for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, then the whole world would be blind and toothless. That we can't just go around using violence on each other because the result is that when you use violence, it returns violence in return because this kills the peaceful complications. So we tell you on a rhetorical level here that any justification of violence means that's a physical violence in return, which you wouldn't want to vote for. So subpoint D, the alternative. We would tell you the alternative is to use your ballot to endorse nonviolent means. That you basically say that you don't believe that violent means are necessary. We tell you this solves for 2 reasons. The first of which is we're able to see the internal flaws. That if whoever is the oppressor or whoever is involved isn't allowed to use a non-peaceful method and they can't actually see the problem, they can always blame it on the alternative. But second we'd say is this means we can't be apathetic. That if you just blame it on the violent people, then you don't have to be paying attention to the problem. Subpoint B, the implications, there's 3, and then I'll get to your point of information. The first which we tell you is this wakes you up from the dream. That we tell you on a rhetorical level, you have to stop remaining docile to this idea that violence is a good solution, that you need to endorse violence is never the solution. 2, we would tell you this has pretty few implications because the case can't really happen. Like maybe this would be, we'll talk about it later, but even if it was a good idea to get rid of Mugabe, this isn't going to happen. But what is going to happen is the ideals they give you, and those ideals are we should use violence as our first choice to get involved. And third, we would tell you that you can't vote for the government team and support the critique because that makes you complicit in the violence. That you have to make a choice when we tell you this. You can't just firm this away because the idea of the plan is that violence is good and the idea of the resolution is violence is just. Sure.
You very eloquently tell us that we have to search for an alternative. Can you please tell me what this alternative is in the instance of Zimbabwe?
Sure. Let's just say we're going to give you that. We're going to be on the off-case position, but the second position. But I also think that the point of this is we're talking about the resolution is you have to search for alternative in any means. And third, we give you that example on the top, and we tell you, look how these work. I mean, it was a pretty bad situation in Britain, and Gandhi and his scholars were able to get out of this. I was on the same level we can encourage us there. All right, well, let's go to the next off-case position, which is the UN dictatorship. Subpoint A, the maybe post-plan, Mugabe was put in place by a foreign government, and that is why he is so corrupt. As they tell you, he was appointed, the British elected him and forced him to office. There's no reason why this can't happen again. Subpoint B, the UN, once they invade, set up a new government of their own choosing. See Iraq, for example, that we're involved and we pick the choices on the same level of the example that happened in the very beginning of Zimbabwe. Third, though, subpoint C, this will create, as it always has, a system of perpetual incumbency. That is, whoever leader is first elected get to the election booths. Now, subpoint D, the impacts, there's two. The first which we tell you is it turns case, because there's no way to justify that this new leader is going to somehow solve the problem of starvation, or it's going to solve the problem of political oppression. These are still going to occur, because unfortunately, these are currently really deep-rooted, seated problems. But second, more importantly, we tell you this is worse, because now the whole world is endorsing the leader. That when the UN endorses him and says, this is your new leader, they can't challenge him anymore. Zimbabwe can't say, look how bad our new leader is, because all the other ones did it. So this is more silencing, because now you have the world endorsing this bad leader. My next position is another off-piece position of reconstruction in Iraq. Subpoint A, uniqueness, we would say, is that the Security Council has already dedicated soldiers to Iraq. But second, we would also tell you is that the United States and all the other big security members have already dedicated their soldiers there as well. Subpoint B, we would tell you, is there's a limited amount of these soldiers and a limited amount of resources that the Security Council has, as well as the nations in the Security Council provide these military forces. So subpoint C, internally, then we would tell you, this means they have to pull out of Iraq. That no longer is there like the active war going on, at least in Bush's rhetoric. So that means that would be on the second burner, that in order to now do this plan of attacking in Zimbabwe, they have to remove their soldiers from this area. So subpoint D, the impacts. We would tell you the United States and the rest of the allies that have got involved with Security Council nations have left this nation in shambles. We tell you that they're out of water, they're out of resources, they don't have any of these important infrastructures for life. So we tell you that quality of life in Iraq is terrible. Subpoint 2, we would tell you, and I realize they're going to say, well, things are really bad there too. But they can't establish this hierarchy, which people are more important. But we have already dedicated our troops to this area, so we tell you should solve the problem we've already gotten involved in and deal with another one later, not at this time. My third, though, my final response here is this is the final part of the impact, is it's exceptionally important that we finish Iraq since we definitely caused that problem. Now, we would agree that we have some responsibility for Mugabe being elected, but we didn't just like destroy all their infrastructure, destroy all their lands, and deal with starvation. That's more important to clean up after our own mess and not just to avoid it. Because that sets a precedent in the future that as long as we cause something, as long as we get rid of the dictator, then it doesn't matter what happens later. Not at this time. Okay. Well, actually, yeah, go ahead, you're last.
All right, so speaking of making hierarchies of different people, at the point where you're endorsing this nonviolent solution, how come the people of Iraq can't do that? Like, why are you endorsing the violent oppression of the Iraqi people?
If I could go back time, I would definitely take back the war in Iraq. But we can't now just avoid them because we're not having war anymore. What I'm talking about is the infrastructure, rebuilding all the things we exploded when we were just dropping our bombs on civilian cities. That's what I'm talking about. That's completely our fault. Now on the starvation point, he deals with the fact that because the land's distributed and we don't want the GMO for food aid and we're using it for bad policies. My response here is that they can't undo this land distribution because they no longer are trained in these farmings as they give you, and they don't have the know-how or the money, as he explains, to farm this land. So post-plan, it's not like peachy keen, no more starvation, because all these problems are inrooted in the country. Now in the political oppression, since there's no ability to speak out, you're killed, and that's like the final impact they give you here. I would tell you absolutely that there is some political problems there, but this isn't going to be solved post-plan, because that's still going to be preventing them from getting any sort of achievement in the end. And finally, on their solvency positions, all they basically say is they answer the advantages. Advantage 1, increasing elections isn't a permanent impact.
I'd like to start just by thanking everyone. Thank you very much, Kyle. We've had a really great time together. Thank you to the Berkeley team, all of you guys. You guys are my inspiration. You guys are why I'm here. You guys are why we've had so much success. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I can't say thanks enough. Thanks to Truman, you guys have put together some interesting positions. The judges, the peanut gallery, wow, you're pretty big today. This is really great. Let's go on to the arguments. I'm going to go in the same exact order, starting with criticism. My first argument is the performative contradiction. That the criticism talks about how you would reject violence in any instance, how you should always take some kind of action to reject this violence. I tell you at the point where they uphold the war in Iraq, where they tell you that you have to keep a militaristic form in that country, that that's a reason why you would reject them for that contradiction. They tell you that you should always look for alternatives. They're not looking for the alternative right now in Iraq because they're saying, we have troops, that means we have to keep troops. They're the ones who aren't using that kind of framework which they advocate at the point where they insist that troops are the only answer in Iraq. I tell you that that's not necessarily true. But furthermore, when you look to their first point about nonviolent methods, when they talk about Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., remember there wasn't a government killing these people because they didn't. Okay, sorry, the government didn't kill them violence does last. We have very short-term violence that's able to solve the problem, yes.
Are you seriously claiming that the lynchings and beatings and killings that were going on all throughout America and the South during the 1950s and 60s, and all of that wasn't happening? That's not oppression?
Okay, yes, that is important. But what you have to understand is the difference is that the government, first of all, wasn't necessarily always the one doing it, but furthermore that some individuals were allowed to speak. In Zimbabwe, it's very different because every single person who speaks out is killed or they're in prison. That's a very different situation. Then they tell you just that we don't consider the alternatives. Let's look at the alternatives that have already been tried. We've already tried sanctions. We've already tried peace talks. We've already tried international negotiations. You tell me what alternative we haven't tried yet, and maybe we can talk about it. But your critique doesn't do that. It doesn't take that next educational step of debate. You vote against them because they're just not going to embrace the situation. You look to the impacts. They talk about how people are going to start blaming the UN for being violent. No, I say that people blame Mugabe for their troubles. That they want Mugabe. They just don't have the opportunity necessarily to speak out from it. They talk about how you're taking out messages, you take away the value of a message. I ask you what message is there when they can't speak out. But furthermore, I think that Kyle and I give you the Speech Act, which gives you that message, because we're the ones telling you how horrible it is right there. When you don't act and you don't do anything for it, you're never getting that kind of message. Then he talks about, no, thank you. Then he talks about the alternative, she talks about the alternative. She tells you that it allows you to see the internal flaw. I don't see how their alternative addresses any internal flaw when they won't even address the situation in Zimbabwe through their criticism, when they won't address the alternative. We tell you the internal flaw. We tell you that people are being oppressed. But furthermore, she tells you that we have to wake up from the dream. I think that this round should be enough for us to wake up from the dream by simply sitting there and doing nothing. You're still in the dream. You never go out of it. Plus, I'd say I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. Yeah, I just pretended like I did, but it doesn't mean anything. Now let's go on. You wish. Okay. Then they talk about pre-fiat. My first argument is a turn. I think it's better to allow for any kind of offensive behavior in public. This is because if you don't allow for it to occur in public, people will do it in private. I'd say that when people have dangerous mindsets in private, that's always going to be a much worse thing. That you want to have it out in public to discuss the issue, to discuss whether or not violence is a good thing or not, instead of having it squelched, which is what their criticism tries to do. But secondly, I'd say turn. You never want to silence our discourse, which is why you never want to vote on a pre-fiat level, because by silencing our discourse, you allow for worse decisions because you don't know both sides of the issue. But third, I'd say turn. This is a wrong forum. Remember, this is a complex idea. You can't necessarily understand the justifications for action. I'd say that you need to read and discuss this without necessary time constraints, so I don't have to talk fast and yell over everyone. No, thank you. But next, I'd say that debate on this kind of issue forces us to disagree. So it forces us to take the opposite position. I'd say that's bad because when you have that debate, you have one debate team who now entrenches that idea because they always have to debate against it. If people don't like the critique because they always lose to it, they're going to start to go against it. Yes.
So you're not entrenching that bad idea when you say on case Mugabe's bad. Now we're supposed to disagree with that?
I'm saying you justify an internal entrenchment in debaters' minds. I'm talking about in the debate world where if you always lose on a certain kind of critique, you start to hate that idea, even if it's true, that's bad for the educational purposes of debate. But next on this critique, I'd say non-unique because there are a militaristic environment where there's going on. But secondly, I'd say that their critique is an example of a policy paralysis, that their inaction justifies things like genocide because it allows the United States and the UN to ignore these problems. I'd say that the only way to combat it is in military force. After everything else has been exhausted, we show you that it has, which means that because their critique is universal and doesn't allow for exceptions, they're saying that if sanctions and other methods don't work, you should never take the next step and solve the problems, which means that if governments know that no one's going to go after them with the military, they can continue this kind of oppression. No, thank you. Next, I'd say that the alternative isn't real. Our plan is a step in the right direction. that mechanism doesn't exist in the status quo, so they don't give you any unique reason why the United Nations would be worse than Mugabe. At that point, you don't look there. But furthermore, I'd say that you don't necessarily get any international, individual voters don't necessarily see the United Nations acting as a form of international support. You look to Iraq, there's still a lot of contentions over who should rule. Part of that is because the individual people use their self-determination to decide what they do. Remember, there's no big impact here that they don't like, that there wouldn't, that is unique to that. Next, they talk about reconstruction. They tell you that they were already in Iraq. First, I tell you that South Africa has asked to send in troops to Zimbabwe, that they're pleading to send in their troops with the United Nations. This is a country that wants to do it, but doesn't necessarily have a ton of troops in Iraq. Furthermore, I would tell you that there's no threshold. The UN just sent peacekeepers to Haiti. That we haven't seen the implications occur. We haven't had to go to Iraq. And then I would tell you that finally, that most of the people in Iraq right now are United States soldiers, not necessarily United Nations soldiers. We're not using the United States for the United Nations. Then they tell you that we don't undo run case. They tell you that we don't undo redistribution. But remember that you can have this kind of redistribution. People who farm can still farm. Remember, the discourse is important in this round. When you allow the people of Zimbabwe to have discourse, you allow them to be self-determinate. You allow them to make their own choices. You're always going to take that above some nebulous critique implication.
My thanks to everyone who's here and everyone who's helped me. There are too many of you to name. The government makes some critical concessions all over the place. They're dropping offense. We're telling you that their arguments are going to make the situation worse. And the only way to solve the surprising thing that they didn't list in their laundry list, and that is nonviolent resistance. We'll begin actually on case. We tell you you can't undo land distribution and you can't fix any of the problems because you don't have money or roads or any infrastructure, and all those skills can't be relearned 3 generations later. They say you can still have them, you can fix everything. That's non-responsive to Marie's argument that the skills have been lost, that it's too late to fix this with a UN-appointed leader. That means all they get to claim on case is some nebulous feel good about yourself for ousting a bad guy advantage, and I don't think that's enough. You're extending her number 2, that they can't solve oppression with plan either. That means they don't get oppression to claim in the last speech, and the doors are starting to close. You're extending her number 3, that advantage 1 isn't just terminal, they can't just claim elections, they've got to claim what will result from those elections. We say it's going to be a UN dictatorship, but before we get to that, we're going to go to Reconstruction. Because I think that this is an easy place to vote for us, because there's only 3 answers, and Marie has developed this in her speech. They say first that South Africa has asked to send troops. My first response is, this sort of mitigates case harm, doesn't it? That if South Africa is just jumping out of the gate to go and solve this, okay, then why do you need a UN intervention that's going to put it into dictatorship? Second, this has nothing to do with Reconstruction. Our argument is not about, South Africa is going to pull out of Iraq. I would agree that their commitment in Iraq is fairly minimal, but I would argue that if you're saying the United Nations Security Council send troops, if they're fiating that, that has to be largely coming from the United States, because they don't provide any other mechanism. Don't let them shift now and say, well, we didn't mean those troops, your dissent goes away. Now, they say there's no threshold, we went to Haiti. My first response is there was a much smaller contingent, and there was largely, I would say, that was a much smaller contingent, first of all. That Haiti is very small, and Zimbabwe needs a lot more. Second, I would say that put us on the brink. That was what stretched us to the complete breaking point, and you wouldn't want to take any additional actions. Third, they say that it's not, that we went to Iraq with the United States, not the United Nations. My response to this is a complete and total vagueness shift. This is why they don't specify any of this in plan, so they can shift out of it later. I argue you have to hold them to it comes from the Security Council. They weren't more specific, so don't let them say, oh, in plan, we meant France and Germany. They said Security Council, and when the Security Council does stuff, a lot of the times it's the United States. The bottom line is, there's no defense, there's only defense on Reconstruction. That means you've got all the impacts Marie tells you, that we have a moral obligation because we messed it up. That if there's any risk that these troops are going to come away from Iraq and not help those people that we made homeless build homes again, then you're going to vote against the government because you can't make that dichotomy. You can't say, well, we thought Iraq was important for a little while, but now Zimbabwe. Now, on the UN dictatorship, and then we'll go to the critique and spend the rest of our time there. They first say empirically denied. When has this ever happened recently? My first response is, how about Zimbabwe? They talk about how the British government, foreign leadership went in and said, we know what's best for you. Here's your new election. Have a fun time. Hope you like incumbency. Bye. And that's exactly Zimbabwe got. Foreign leaders don't make good nation builders for nations that need things other than reconstruction. We can help roads, but they don't need roads. Your point.
How does your example about the British government prove that the United Nations, which is a country that is cause dictatorship?
I think if you're claiming that the Security Council doesn't have concrete interests and isn't made up of countries, then your world is much more fun than mine. Unfortunately, it's just not the case. Moreover, they say next they have, free and open elections and they're going to have self-determination. My first response is, I don't remember that mandated plan. All I remember hearing is that they were going to send some troops in and they were going to take out Mugabe. What happens after that is a matter of what we can prove. We say, when has a foreign government in Zimbabwe or in Africa ever made the situation better? It is time to start looking for how these people can do things for themselves, but I don't want to give away the critique too much. Third, they say this is not going to be any worse. At worst, it's like Mugabe. Wrong. Extend Marie's number 2 impact that now the government is legitimate and no one will ever try to fix it. We've gone in and said, hey, here's your new government. We're definitely not fixing this one. You're stuck with this forever. At least Mugabe is recognized as illegitimate, which means the nonviolent dissent is going to be able to fix things. But they put in a new, equally bad leader. Now, they say that, the individuals don't care about the United Nations. Again, I don't understand what this responds to in the position. Marie talks about the system of perpetual incumbency, and I want you to extend that. That's what always happens with UN reconstruction efforts in Iraq. They're still the colonial powers, you just call them the Security Council now. The first response on the critique is performative contradiction, rejected because they have helped the war in Iraq. My first response is, that's a lie about our argument. Remember Marie's funny joke about how she could travel back in time to reverse the war? I don't appreciate being characterized as someone who's pro-war when I spent a lot of last year talking about how much I hated it. Second, we don't uphold violence in Iraq, we uphold reconstruction to fix the violence. There's nothing violent about building roads. That's what we're doing. Just because they're troops doesn't mean they're shooting their guns all the time. We're saying they need water and we can help with that. That's not saying we should go in and be violent. That is an absolute ridiculous caricature of our argument, not our argument itself. Sorry, not right now. They say there's no violence, that nobody's going to be killed. My first, or that in these situations with Gandhi and civil rights, there's no violence, no oppression, no one is killed. My first response is, I think that's not true. British colonial rule was brutal. It is far worse than anything you can imagine. And Mahatma Gandhi can still stand up and say, the only way to free ourselves is by nonviolent resistance. We won't meet violence with violence, but that's the mistake they want you to do. Second, I think that when they characterize the civil rights movement and all the struggles in India as not that bad as Zimbabwe, they bite into Marie's argument about how you can't create moral hierarchies of suffering. They're trying to do that. They're trying to say all the people killed in lynchings and by British rule and colonialism and Jim Crow, well, that was a solvable problem, but this is really bad. We need the UN now. Point.
So when was the last time that you went to Iraq and laid in front of a tank?
Honest to God, if that option had been available for the Iraqis at the time, I wish that could have solved things. They could have resisted Saddam that way, and I think that would have been better. Next, they say there already is violence in the country. Right, because of their mentality. If you're going to create more violence in the country, the best response to that violence is nonviolence. You don't think there was violence in colonial rule Britain? Guess what, folks? There was. And this argument doesn't prove anything. Fourth, they say plan is violence. Our violence is better. No thanks. I would say extend this argument. Our violence is better. This is the good violence. This is what's going to meet with the retaliation. This is what's going to meet with the violence always be getting more violence in the future. They're biting into the critique. Thanks for the sweet new link, is what I guess I'm saying. Fifth, they say look at the alternatives we've tried. Sanctions, talks, negotiations. What haven't we tried? How about peaceful resistance? How about the tactics of Gandhi and Martin Luther King? Civil disobedience that shows the nation and shows the world that you're suffering and doesn't just distract with a violent message. I say that we've never tried that alternative, and they don't even consider it. Extend Marie's number 2 link. They say that they're not going to blame, they're just going to blame Mugabe for the violence. I don't think that's true, and I don't think they give you any warrant for that on the impacts. They say what message is there, and that our Speech Act is the message. I think that ignores the fact that fundamentally they're silencing the message of those protesters. That's just defense anyway. Extend, though, the number 3 impact and the number 4 impact of violence against violence in return. Now, on the alternative, they say there's no internal flaw. We ask you to use your ballot as a form of dissent, and that all of that can be solved. They say if the round is enough, you can't just do nothing. I would ask that you use your ballot to recognize that nonviolent dissent is better. They say it's better to allow for offensive behavior in public. Yes, and then critique that behavior with your ballot. I would say they can do offensive things, but they should then choose our advocacy. Next, they say don't silence our discourse. We're not. We're evaluating it and then telling you that discourse isn't a good idea. Third, they say wrong forum, too complicated. What's complicated about nonviolence? There's no warrant behind this argument. It says forces us to disagree with things that are obviously true. Then why should we have to disagree with Mugabe? Next, they say non-unique. It's a military environment now. Yeah, that's why we ran the critique. They say it creates policy paralysis. No, you can use your ballot to create transversal dissent. You can dissent against the system of violence. Last, they say the alternative isn't real. Fiat isn't either. You can recognize with your ballot that only non-violence can solve. People, please, be at peace.
again, just for all your facility, changing the order. It's going to go the UN, dictatorship position, and reconstruction and decay. It's been an excellent round, but there's been too many problems with Truman's advocacy for them to remain consistent in this round, to the point where they're not only not consistent with their advocacy, but their advocacies in and of themselves have full flaws. That means you're obviously going to be voting for the government UC Berkeley. First of all, the UN dictatorship position. Remember, your courts are going to be able to remember Elizabeth's empirically denied position, because remember, they're telling you that we don't specify in case that we don't pick a leader. We're going to agree with that, because we don't specify in case that we're not picking a leader for the Zimbabwean government. At the point where we're not picking a leader, that means there's absolutely no impact, because there's not going to be some sort of global moral legitimacy assigned to the leader that comes after Mugabe. Remember, the only moral legitimacy assigned in this case is that Mugabe is bad. And I think it's important that the world recognizes that Mugabe is a terrible person, that starvation is not okay. And that's the only precedent that case is going to be able to set. So at that point, you realize that there's absolutely no impact flowing through on this debate. And remember, you drop down to the bottom, she's telling you that the government's going to give it legitimacy, but again, the only legitimacy is inaction. And not acting on a situation is the only legitimacy that they're going to get. So at the point where they have no advocacy in this round beyond that of the critique, remember, only case is going to be able to solve for those problems. And if case is the only advocacy, then inaction is the only legitimacy Mugabe is ever going to be able to get. No impact, don't vote there. Reconstruction. On Reconstruction, remember, the only argument we need here is that there's absolutely no threshold. Like, Ian's asserting to you that there is no brink, but Ian gets away with too many assertions in all sorts of places. Don't allow this one, because all he's telling you is like, well, we went to Haiti and that was the brink, but that wasn't the brink. It's not our burden to provide the opposition team with the brink analysis and the ground in that debate. That's what he's advocating. At the point where he's just asserting that, you must punish him, because remember, he's never given you that analysis, he's never given you the numbers. Also, you're looking at the top, you're looking at the South African argument. Back at you. What you're going to see on the South African argument is like, sure, they're telling you mitigates case, sure, it says that you don't need it, but remember, they want to go in with the United Nations, one, because they don't want the repercussions coming from the future leader of Zimbabwe, because he might have some sort of vestige of hatred towards that country, and also remember, they don't want to go in alone. Nobody should be forced to go into any military conflict by themselves, and any country, especially specifically living on the same continent, like, that's like having a bad roommate, and trust me, I've got two. Now on to critique. Critique is simple. Vague impacts, plans, specific impacts, violence and status quo, systemic. Who solves the problem? We do. Critique does nothing. At the end of the round, when you're signing your ballot, realize that your ballot doesn't mean that you're going to go lay in front of a tank. Remember that it doesn't mean you're going to go into a ballot office and reject Mugabe. All that it means is that you voted for ridiculous advocacy because you believe our discourse should be silenced. And at the point where you believe that, you're not solving anything. If you vote for us, you realize our Speech Act is an advocacy which shows that we should do something that the problem is intrinsic in the status quo, which means you're always going to be voting for UC Berkeley. On the performance contradiction debate, remember he's telling you he's anti-war. That's great, so am I, but you choose your arguments and you should stick to your guns. At the point where you're saying that we should stay in Iraq, we should finish the job, finishing the job assumes that there will be more deaths. Finishing the job assumes that the UN peacekeepers with hot rifle barrels are still going to be there. And at the point where they're still there, people are still going to die. And remember, even if the Iraqis initiate an attack, then the UN peacekeepers are going to fight back. That means there's violence. That means that their advocacy is inconsistent. You should vote them down. Because any inconsistent advocacy means they don't believe in their position. And if they don't believe in your position, why should you? Now,
point of order.
What?
There was no reasoning in the first speech why it even mattered. All she said is you contradict yourself and then moved on. There was no reason why you should vote against us because
she says that you should have sincere advocacy and that like you should be voted down. That was the first thing she said at the performance contradictions.
Panel will take it under consideration.
Even though we don't need that argument, I think it's important moving down as a chief flow. Alright, so they're talking about the British colonial government. They're telling you the colonial rule is bad. Remember, the only thing that Elizabeth is telling you here is that there are different degrees of government intervention. Like, yeah, sure, colonial involvement was really bad. I agree. I understand. I've read the books. Oh, God. But I also understand that in Zimbabwe, you can't even lie in the street, because if you lie in the street and you don't fight back, you will automatically be killed. And that's not being a precedent that you want to set. Because granted, like, sure, violence is bad, but what's worse than violence is more violence. And remember, since critique doesn't solve anything, the only way to check that back is by voting for the government team. Their pre-fiat rhetoric isn't going to mean anything in this round. Also, move down the argument, they're telling you that it's not peaceful. However, remember, you can't fiat via your ballot the people actually going out and having nonviolent action against Mugabe's government. You can't fiat the people who are ever going to do that, and you signing that ballot isn't going to mean you're going to go outside, and they're not even going to hear about your ballot, because I'm sure they could care less about NPDA as they're starving.
the argument that counterclaim isn't fiat out anything or solve anything, or the critique doesn't, is a new argument.
Wow.
I don't think that's true at all. I think that was a fair argument, but I give you a
Under consideration.
All right. That said, the only revolution I need on the critique is that liberalism's arguments that they're never getting to is that the critique is universal. It's telling you that in all cases you're never going to be violent. There are absolutely no exceptions ever. At the point where they're setting that precedent that there's never going to be any exceptions whatsoever, that means you can't even fight it for yourself. That means if somebody's coming at you with a knife, you're never going to be able to defend yourself. You should sit there and take it for whatever reason possible. Remember, that's the precedent that the critique says, and you should always vote against it because it justifies genocide. It justifies sitting back and watching the people return. And finally, on the back of the critique, remember, they are silencing our discourse because what they're doing is they're creating a hierarchy. They're telling you that one team is better than the other. You should vote us down. Don't vote us down. Vote us up. Show them that the critique is ridiculous.
That would be fine too. Will be someone else. Based on your thoughts, Counselor. I'm done.
Well, this person seems to think. There used to be a program on that.
Yep. Okay. Let's see it on the ground.
I think it's going to be 4 here.
Yeah. That's all I guess.
Once again, congratulations. It was a 6-1 decision, and advancing to the final round is the opposition from Truman. I'm going to forego my critique because I wrote on the ballot. I don't think anybody wants a detailed critique.
Yeah, okay. Make sure we're beyond, hit that cap. Especially when it's like we've got some conceded action areas that are recycling pilots and flash rather than certain. We can go deeper than that if you'd like.